Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming. It is an absolute joy to be here, and it's so fun to talk about sleep. It's one of my absolute favorite topics in terms of different things that you can do with patients, right? I mean, neurotransmitter and hormone optimization for a plethora of symptoms is amazing, but when you start helping patients sleep better as step one, so many of the other daytime symptoms improve. And that's why it's been a joy of mine. I've been in practice since 2000. So this is my 21st year, and I've just been enjoying helping patients sleep all of those years. It's just such a fun place to begin with patients. So today's topic is the chemistry of sleep and successful strategies for sleep optimization, because so often it's important to understand that patients go on Dr. Google and they start to search what they can do and what they can take, and they begin their journey towards better sleep, but then they often get lost and confused along the way and often more frustrated. So if we can objectify how to help them using some objective biomarker testing, we typically have a much better mechanism with which to help them get a good night's sleep. And for that, I just think it's wonderful. Let's go ahead and start the slideshow. Objectives today. We want to review the definition and the role of neurotransmitters for cortisol and sleep. We want to incorporate neurotransmitter and cortisol and melatonin testing into the evaluation process for patients, as well as to improve what we're going to do and give us our roadmap that way. So that's super important. We want to incorporate neurotransmitter and adrenal testing in a way that helps not only approach the symptom that they have, but just as important, gives us the roadmap to improve their function so that if they are on prescription medications and they want to move off of them, maybe that's an opportunity. If they are on supplements and they're wondering what they should take next, or if anything is working the way that it should, that's an opportunity. And all of those various scenarios can help us if we have some objective biomarkers such as neurotransmitters and hormones. So that's pretty fabulous. Hold on just one second. I'll see if I can get my chat bar up here. So let's go into what is insomnia. If a patient's going to be up in the middle of the night, I guarantee you they're going to start to Google what is going on with sleep and what is the proper definition of I'm not sleeping, which is insomnia. And they're going to find, for example, the Mayo Clinic's website is going to pop up front and center, right? So from the Mayo Clinic's website, we took the definition of insomnia as a common sleep disorder that can make it hard to fall asleep, hard to stay asleep, or cause you to wake up too early and not be able to get back to sleep. You may still feel tired when you wake up. Insomnia can sap not only your energy level and mood, but also your health, your work performance, and your quality of life. Now, all of that is true, and it's a no-brainer that if you don't sleep, you don't feel well. I like to take it and spin it a little bit and say, okay, we already know you don't feel well. We know it's because of sleep. How are we going to reframe insomnia other than just us? I can't sleep. Well, you have to reframe it through the stress response and through the autonomic nervous system. So I like to discuss insomnia as you're having some type of either physical, cognitive, or emotional stress response. And if that physical, cognitive, or emotional causation stress response is happening, it affects your fight or flight nervous system, which is in balance with your parasympathetic rest and digest nervous system. And it doesn't turn out well long term. And we need to make sure that we can do something to help it balance itself out and get back to a normal sleep-wake cycle and good energy. And how do we do that? We start to look at neurotransmitters, right? And if we're going to look at neurotransmitters, oh, too fast. We want to recognize what their definition is. Their definition is they are chemical messengers that regulate the many physical and emotional processes, including movement, stress responses, cognition and attention and memory, emotions, physical energy, cravings, sleep, pain, and more, including digestion and immune function. So often neurotransmitters get put into this little box of they're only involved in brain function. And that's not fair to the neurotransmitters, and it's not fair to your peripheral nervous system. We have to understand that the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system use neurotransmitters, and even the endocrine system and the immune system utilize neurotransmitters to talk back and forth, that crosstalk function a little bit. And we want to be able to see how that's working as kind of a symphony, if you will, all together. So that becomes very important to understand that neurotransmitters do a lot more than just brain. That's one of the reasons that people throw neurotransmitter testing under the bus all the time. They just think it's just for the central nervous system, and thus it's not valid. And it really is for the peripheral nervous system more than the central nervous system. It's total body output done in a urine collection over the course of a couple hours to give us a window into what stage of stress responses we're in, contributing to various symptoms. Now, cortisol is a little different. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid produced by your adrenal cortex. Remember, your adrenal gland has a cortex on the outside, and it has a medulla on the inside. Excuse me. So cortisol comes from the cortex of the adrenal gland, and it mediates various metabolic processes, such as gluconeogenesis. It will boost blood sugar levels, so that's cool. It has anti-inflammatory and immunosuppressive properties, and levels in the blood may become elevated in response to stress, physical or psychological. Let's think about that for a second. If we are going to use one hormone for a stress response, cortisol would be our game, right? That would be our friend to look at. Excuse me. But if we only look at cortisol, so often for stress, cortisol rhythms are given as the go-to test. And I'm going to tell you as a clinician who's been doing this type of testing since 2004, cortisol is incredibly important. But cortisol without neurotransmitters, especially dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine, you're missing the other half of the adrenal gland, which is the medulla. So make sure you test all of it together. Understand that there's no one hormone such as cortisol, and there's no one neurotransmitter such as dopamine or norepinephrine or serotonin or GABA that help you sleep better in and of themselves. Now, if you're new to this testing, right, and you've never done this testing, and your last 5 insomnia patients have come in and you've given them 100 milligrams of 5-HTP for serotonin support at bedtime, and they all started sleeping better, hey, that's great. But it's probably not going to stay that simple. When you get into more complicated, more chronic insomnia patients, they start to need additional supplements to support the various challenges they're having in their different neurochemistry as well as their hormones. So this little slide here demonstrates the fact that norepinephrine and serotonin and dopamine can all overlap. They can all affect mood and motivation and energy. They can all affect metabolism and how easy it is to either pass on something that you know is bad for you or really crave it like crazy. They can affect attentional systems. They're not just there by themselves. If it was as simple as you have a tough time falling asleep, you need GABA, we wouldn't need any of this testing, right? Just like if mood was as simple as, oh, you're depressed, you just need serotonin support, we wouldn't need any of this testing. And that's simply not the way that the nervous system and the endocrine system and the adrenal system works. They work together, and different people fatigue different pathways and different chemistry at different times. And that's why it's so nice to objectify it, including for sleep. Now, depending upon the type of practitioner you are and what you like to do, what does that mean? That means that a lot of you may love to do bioidentical hormones, but you don't necessarily like to do diet and gut, right? And stool analysis. Or some of you, like myself, may love to do neuro rehab of different types. It could be biofeedback and neurofeedback. It could be brain-based exercises. Or maybe you like to do physical hands-on care, but you don't necessarily like to do endocrinology and hormones. The neat thing about this is that no matter where you start, neurology, endocrinology, or immunology, they all play off of each other. So when you watch the very top of this picture, you have your immune mediators, you have neurotransmitters, and you have endocrine or neuroendocrine factors. And it's a circle, or in this case, a triangle, if you will. They all play off of each other. They all talk to each other. And it's important to recognize that when you affect one area, you will ultimately affect the other systems as well. This is often referred to as the neuroendoimmune super optimization system of sorts. So whether you come at it from neurology, endocrinology, or immunology, you will affect the other two systems. It's not really a super system, but it's thought of as a super system that way. When we look at this, we can say, geez, if we affect the nervous system and the endocrine system, we can affect hormones, such as the HPA axis over here on the left, or blood pressure, circulation, heart rate. We can affect the immune system. If you're under chronic stress and chronic fight or flight, your immune system's going to take a hit eventually, right? That's not great for it. What about the people that are under chronic fight or flight, and all of a sudden their digestive tract starts to change, and it becomes a neurogenic GI symptomatology with maybe an irritable bowel, where they just can't modulate speed of transit anymore? That happens too. Or what about the people with, from a sensory perspective, start to have pain? You guys all see a lot of patients with pain. Pain is very, very common. And if you're a chiropractor like myself, we like to work on muscles and joints and get them moving again and get them strong and loose and really make them do what they should do biomechanically. But what if that's not enough? Maybe looking at hormones and neurotransmitters is a great place to go, especially if their pain is keeping them up at night and they're developing insomnia along with pain. Let's look at the chemistry while we work on the biomechanics. So I get excited about all that. The neat thing is, no matter where you start, no matter where you are as a clinician, you get to start in your favorite place, right? Your place that you feel you're the best at, and then fold in the other options for testing and optimization. Today, we're going to be talking about sleep with neurotransmitters and hormones. Neurotransmitter testing has been used for all different types. This is types of symptoms. Sorry, just to finish that thought. This is something that almost feels like a catch-all to me after teaching this for as long as we have, because you sit there and go, well, of course, neurotransmitters are involved in brain things like mood and attention. And yeah, they're probably involved in sleep, but they're involved in, yes, mood, attention, sleep, physical energy, pain processing, irritable bowel, which we kind of just mentioned, certainly headaches and head pain. What about challenges with addictions? What about challenges with, geez, Scott, I'm changing my diet and I'm really cleaning up my gut a lot and I still can't burn as many calories as I want during the day, even though my watch says I am. I'm not losing the weight the same way. I'm just having a tough time stripping these pounds off and moderating my weight. These can be involved in this, and cravings and poor impulse control, right? Whether that's alcohol or sugar or drugs, whatever it may be, dopamine and serotonin and GABA all play into that. So yes, we're focusing on sleep. No, if you're new to this type of testing, it's used by practitioners all around the world for all different types of symptomatology, depending upon what type of practice they have. So don't just take neurotransmitter and hormone testing and box it into insomnia. That's not fair to those types of tests. It really is used for a lot of various symptomatologies. And the simple reason is, as you can imagine, the nervous system, the endocrine system, and the immune system are all involved in these symptoms, right? You can't have any of this without affecting the nervous system in some way, shape, or form. So we better make sure we have some objective markers for it. When we figure out what's either a little low or a little high, and if you think about all these hormones and neurotransmitters as fuel tanks, we then want to start to say, well, what are we going to do to build the systems that are depleted back up? And the way to help optimize these systems is to look in the pathway of how you actually manufacture and make neurotransmitters biochemically and say, well, here's our precursors, and they're amino acid precursors. A little background, if you're new to this, you generally want to take them on an empty belly. The purpose of the empty belly is that they compete with proteins for absorption. So if you take them with carbohydrates, right, a couple bites of fruit, right, or maybe some gluten-free crackers or something of that sort, you're not going to really compete for absorption with your amino acid supplements. But if you have a 3-egg omelet and throw down a bunch of amino acid supplements, you're probably going to dilute how many of your supplements you're actually going to be able to absorb. So you want to give them a 30-minute lead time from protein-rich sources of food. That's the goal. And amino acids are known to cross the blood-brain barrier very easily. Neurotransmitters don't always cross the blood-brain barrier easily, but the amino acid precursors that then become neurotransmitters can cross the blood-brain barrier easily and then convert into the neurotransmitters that we're looking to support, as long as given the proper cofactors. So tryptophan, or 5-hydroxytryptophan, converts into serotonin, right? Tyrosine converts into dopamine and norepinephrine and epinephrine. Glutamine into glutamate and eventually GABA. You can take GABA just as a supplement and it stays GABA. Theanine's generally calming in nature. It doesn't convert into any other neurotransmitters, but it's very calming and it can block glutamate levels down a little bit, block some of the receptors a little bit. Taurine also acts as a neurotransmitter and an amino acid, very calming in nature. Histidine becomes histamine, and histamine is very excitatory both to the immune system and the nervous system. And phenylalanine becomes PEA. Now, for those of you that are new to all these amino acids, fear not, there are lots of great flowcharts out there. And here's one such flowchart. This particular one comes from Labrix and doctors' data. It has the neurotransmitter pathways on it. You will have to become knowledgeable in these pathways to a certain extent. Meaning, if you know, for example, that you want to support someone's serotonin, we need to know that 5-HTP and tryptophan are precursors to the serotonin pathway. That's fair. That only makes sense. If you know that you want to support somebody, for example, their dopamine level during the day, right? L-dopa and tyrosine are precursors to dopamine. All right, this is not a neurotransmitter basic introduction class. LabRex and Doctors Data have plenty of classes that are basic introduction classes for these types of flowcharts and spreadsheets that look at how do we actually make more neurotransmitters? How do we support hormone systems, sex hormones and stress hormones, etc. So utilize those systems, and we'll talk a little bit more about my opportunity for that as well at the end of this. I'm happy to help you learn the basic neurotransmitter aspects as well if you like how I teach. But there's a ton of great reference material out there, much of which is complementary. And these labs and these clinicians, such as Drs. Teta and LabRex, love to talk the talk. This is what they do in their private practices, and they love to discuss how you can do it in your own practice. Okay. Now you know that it can be used for a plethora of symptomatology. We need one unifying concept that's going to help us understand how can we use all these different neurotransmitters and a handful of these different hormones to actually be able to support somebody in terms of sleep, energy, mood, attention, cognition. And I'm going to encourage you, at least this is the best thing I've come up with over the years, to put it through the lens of the autonomic nervous system, like we said earlier, and think about neurotransmitters, the adrenal system, and how the sympathetic nervous system of the brain comes down and drives various neurotransmitters, various hormones such as cortisol in the periphery to kick you into fight or flight mode. Now, we don't want you living in fight or flight mode all the time, but we also don't want you living in parasympathetic rest and digest mode all the time, right? We need a balance there. And during the day, you do need a little bit more sympathetic tone, if you will, a little bit more dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine, especially norepi and epi. But you still need lots of serotonin and GABA and calming neurotransmitters to balance that out, that teeter-totter out all day long. Otherwise, you tend to feel overexcited and anxious and wound up. At night, there's a different teeter-totter that happens. And you'll start to see in patients that really sleep well, norepinephrine and epinephrine start to drop. And those inhibitory neurotransmitters, serotonin and GABA, still stay nice and high so that you sleep like a rock star. That's how the neurotransmitter piece works. Cortisol and melatonin are similar, and we'll get into those in a couple slides. If you put all of this into an autonomic fight or flight mechanism, we say, okay, healthy baseline, you're cruising down here. All your fuel tanks are full, right? They're all just kind of topped off. Serotonin's topped off, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, GABA, glycine, histamine, PEA, cortisol, melatonin, and all your sex hormones are topped off, even though this isn't a sex hormone conversation today as much. A stressor hits. Remember, that stressor can be physical, cognitive, or emotional. Doesn't matter what it is. And it pushes you into hyper sympathetic nervous system mode. Is it good to be in a hyper mode? It's not bad because it helps you survive. It's a survival mechanism. But you don't necessarily want to stay there for long. The best way to not stay there is to modify whatever lifestyle challenge gave you that stress, physical, cognitive, or emotional, get over that lifestyle hurdle, and come back to your healthy baseline. That would be ideal. But in this day and age, so many people get stuck in these long-term chronic autonomic nervous system, sympathetic drive type of fight or flight mechanisms that eventually fuel tanks start to run dry. And all of a sudden, it might be serotonin on somebody. For someone else, it might be GABA. For someone else, their cortisol rhythm might go flat, right? Someone else might totally tank their sex hormones, even though they're only 30 years old. These various fuel tanks, when pushed hard by the autonomic sympathetic nervous system, eventually fatigue. And depending upon where that patient is in the timeline of their own neuroadrenal sympathetic fight or flight autonomic response, it's a mouthful, isn't it? Because people always argue about what you should call it. So there you go. You got every name in the book. If that sympathetic system is starting to fatigue as time goes on, if you test them down here, they're already flatlined and all of their levels are low across the board. Most of your patients are going to present to you somewhere in the middle. So sorry. This stage 2 are kind of mid-stage. It's a mixed bag. Some markers are high, some are looking pretty good, some are actually looking low. Some people will present to you still in this early stage where everything's cranking high and you just need to calm a couple things down. Recognize early on in your learning of this that the change in where patients are doesn't invalidate the test. It's simply that you need to learn different ways of thinking about it and how to interpret it. Meaning, when I first started, I'm like, oh my gosh, you have two patients that are insomniacs. One person's cranking high across the board, and one person's depleted across the board. This testing must be garbage. No, that's not it at all. You need to understand and put it through the lens of autonomic sympathetic nervous system and where they are on their timeline of fatigability. So it's a nice way to start to think about it. People can have the same symptoms. They're just on different timelines of fatigue. And what goes into this? Lifestyle goes into this, genetics goes into this, low inflammatory food and diet go into this, right? Relationships certainly go into this, causing stress, feeling supported, things of this nature. So everyone goes through these stages eventually. We want to make sure we understand where people are. And these are the kind of 5 common patterns of insomnia that I see before we do some case studies. Recognize that either someone's, okay, you have an insomniac in front of you now, and you're looking at their test results and you're saying, how should I kind of think about this? Well, number 1, are their excitatory neurotransmitters elevated? And for this case, we're going to be talking about norepinephrine and epinephrine with insomnia. If those guys are cranking high, it's real hard to sleep. You don't need a whole lot of norepinephrine and epinephrine to sleep at night. Adrenaline is not part of the big, giant, sleep-happy goal. Inhibitory neurotransmitters are depleted. And remember, they're in a little bit of a teeter-totter. So serotonin and GABA, are those guys running low? Is that a problem? You can put glycine in there if you want to. You can put taurine in there if you want to. Immune markers are elevated. From a neuroimmune perspective, I want you to be dialing in real close attention on glutamate and on histamine. So if that glutamate and that histamine are high, that neurotransmitter system, both in terms of the nervous system and the immune system, might be cranking real high, making it hard for people to feel calm, happy, and sleep well. Now, hormones. Cortisol. If cortisol is elevated at night, you all know that that's usually not great for a sleep cycle. And melatonin, if melatonin is depleted, it's also not great for a sleep cycle. Melatonin, generally an antioxidant. Historically, if you went back 30 years, we talked a lot about it as a hormone. It's kind of a neuropeptide / antioxidant. And yes, it is released in very small amounts into the brain for sleep onset, but it's also utilized throughout the body as an antioxidant. So don't get too hung up on melatonin just being hormone-like. I don't think that's true. None of the research seems to really show that, but it does seem to have very strong antioxidant capability. And it is used for sleep initiation a little bit, as other antioxidants can be beneficial for that a little bit at night too. So those are your 5. You might have one of them. You might have all 5 of them. Maybe you've got some mix or match. Each one is an opportunity. I don't need every chronic insomniac to have all 5. I'd rather you not. But if you are that skewed, well, man, I've got a roadmap that says you can go all of these various places and take a look at what's going on and really get a beautiful picture objectively of where do we want to go. Come on, slide deck. Let's go on into this first case. We're going to start out just nice and generic, right? This is a otherwise healthy 45-year-old. No medications, little tiny bit of melatonin on occasion. And when I say tiny, it's less than 3 milligrams. Scott, I have difficulty falling and staying asleep. One of the first things you want to ask your patients when you're going through their history form with them, unless you like to use sleep questionnaires, which of course you're welcome to do that too. There's some nice ones out there. But I like to just talk my way through it. And there's a handful of questions I ask. I say, is it tough for you to fall asleep? I don't just say insomnia, yes or no. It's got to get more specific than that. Is it tough to fall asleep? Yes or no. Is it tough to stay asleep? Yes or no. And if so, how many times a night are you waking up? Once you're awake, how long are you awake for? Scott, I only wake up once a night, but I'm up for 30 minutes or 2 hours. Okay, that's a problem, right? Total sleep duration through the night? And are you tired in the morning? Those are the 5 questions I ask when I'm going through a history form and people are talking about sleep challenges. And I want those to be dialed in pretty tight so that you feel your best. So in this case, Scott, my primary difficulty is falling and staying asleep. And you can imagine if you have difficulty falling and staying asleep, it's going to be real hard to have energy during the day. 45 certainly isn't too high up there on the age chain, but it's different than 25, where you can just push through, right? And caffeinate yourself and feel like, maybe I'll get through this in some way, shape, or form. You're not going to be able to do that at 45 years old. Where are we going to go? we did kind of these neurobasic panels. So you get these 9 neurotransmitters, and then you add on, in this case, a single saliva for a cortisol and a melatonin. If you like rhythms, you could add a 4-point cortisol, right? Or you can even add more than that if you choose to. You could add a melatonin rhythm where you could do 3 points during the day and see, all right, where's melatonin during the day and does it spike up at night like it should? I personally like to do a single saliva sample for my insomniac patients because compliance is high. They'll say, yeah, I'm happy to do a urine sample and a saliva sample before bed. If they have a hard time falling asleep, do the sample before bed. If they have a hard time staying asleep, do the sample in the middle of the night. If, like this one, they have a hard time falling and staying asleep, just do the collection before bed and call it a day. Don't bother with collecting samples in the middle of the night. So here we go. Inhibitory neurotransmitters. How are we doing? Serotonin down at 65, reference range up to 98 for an adult male. We have some opportunities there to support that, right? That should be at the top of your list in terms of helping people sleep. Some type of either 5-HTP, 5-hydroxytryptophan, or tryptophan. Dopamine levels, 142, well within the reference range of 110 to 200. Norepinephrine, I like these guys on the low side of 18 to 42. He's down at 26. I'm just fine with that. You don't need a lot of norepinephrine. And even if he was down towards 20 or even 15, I would still be okay with that. You don't need a lot of norepinephrine for sleeping. But then we get to this poor epinephrine. Now remember, if you're new to this, these are called your catecholamines: dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. Dopamine converts to norepinephrine. Norepinephrine converts to epinephrine. They convert into each other. They're all excitatory in nature primarily in terms of their mechanisms and their symptoms that they'll present with. We don't need a lot of epinephrine or adrenaline at night. So here we're doing pretty good on dopamine. We're doing pretty good on norepinephrine, but we're cranking out our epinephrine. We got to figure out a way to get that guy down. I would like that to be down closer to that like 2 range versus 6 with a reference range all the way up to 7.3. So we need to figure out a way to inhibit that. The nicest way to inhibit that epinephrine is to boost up that serotonin. Serotonin and the catecholamines are on a teeter-totter. So if you support somebody's serotonin with some tryptophan or 5-HTP, it should calm down dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine a little bit. So that's how we're going to do that, and that'll feel nice. What else do we have? Glutamate levels. Glutamate is highly excitatory, but it's also can come from the immune system a little bit. So we call it a neuroimmune marker, right? And we like these to be usually down on that lower 30th or 20th percentile. I like them down low. Doing great on that. 14, reference range 9 to 40, awesome. GABA, 1.7. That is on the low side for this reference range of 1.6 to 3.5. So how do we want to actually help support GABA? Well, that should be pretty simple. We just want to take a look at supplements from various manufacturers and find some GABA that they could try at night. It's at least on the options list along with serotonin support, right? Glycine, as long as we're in the reference range, I'm happy. This is pretty good at 700. We're fine. Histamine, neuroimmune modulator again. I like it on the low side personally. So if we can be down, in this case, down towards 20 or 15, even towards 12 would be okay with a reference range of 12 to 30. He's down at 15. That's doing nice. PEA has a lot to do with focus and concentration, cognition, and a busy brain would be a nice way to think about it symptomatically. At least that's how I describe it to my patients. PEA levels should not be cranking high at night. You're going to feel way, way, way overexcited if you end up looking to see what's happening with PEA levels, and PEA levels are cranking high, and you're going to be thinking about what you should already be doing for the holidays, even though it's only October, such as it is now, right? So we don't necessarily want to be looking at those PEA levels sky high. In fact, we want them to be pretty dang low as time goes on. So at least at night. So 36 there with a 26 to 70 range, awesome. Creatinine is simply a measure of how concentrated the urine is so that we have a baseline of where to measure those other neurotransmitters, right? And then we have a cortisol in this person. 8.8 reference range, 0.33 to 7. Optimal range, 1 to 4 at bedtime. And we're cranking out at 8. That doesn't feel good at all. So cortisol coming down, an absolute opportunity. What about melatonin? They're an occasional melatonin user. 29 range, 4 to 25, right? Optimal, 8 to 24. They're up a little higher. I'm okay with you being a little high on melatonin. I'm not concerned about that. If you're actually on the lower side, I would say melatonin should definitely be an option. In this case, if you like the way that low dose melatonin feels at night for sleep, even though you're not sleeping great yet, you can continue it if you choose to. So some great opportunities. Make serotonin go up, make epinephrine go down, make GABA go up. Cortisol, that needs to come down. Melatonin, we want to keep that guy nice and elevated where he is. That looks pretty good on the high side of normal. What are we going to do? Give him some 5-HTP, anywhere between 50 and 200 milligrams, but he's on the lower side of 65. We can start at 100, and if we want to, work up to 200 milligrams at bedtime. Taurine. Taurine binds loosely to GABA receptors. It's calming in the vast majority of people. Well tolerated across the board for the vast majority of people. 200 to 500 milligrams at bedtime should feel very nice. Phosphatidylserine resensitizes cortisol receptors so that cortisol can bind better. 50 to 200 milligrams at bedtime so that hopefully that cortisol system has more sensitive receptors so that the cortisol you are producing, which is plenty in this case before bed, binds better to the receptor and gives a better inhibitory feedback to mellow out that HPA axis in terms of cortisol output. Bonabaleve, enzyme modulator, cortisolic acid, anywhere between 100 and 600 milligrams in the evening, up to an hour before bedtime would be nice since he's cranking cortisol really high. Sometimes you'll even do a double dose. You'll do a little bit before dinner and again a little bit more before bedtime, an hour before bedtime to help decrease cortisol. Now it does it by decreasing cortisol and increasing cortisone. That's fine. And it'll do it very efficiently within just a couple of days. So those are some great opportunities. This is going to turn out beautifully. You've got a roadmap that says, wow, instead of just trying melatonin and getting frustrated, let's go after all of these other different markers. And here's some of the supplements that we can use to get you there, right? If he were to be the person who said, once I'm asleep, I'm fine, I just can't fall asleep, you might change this protocol just a little bit and take these an hour or more before bedtime to start slowing the system down as you roll into the bedtime hour. But because he's the person who says falling asleep and staying asleep is kind of hard, just take him sometime an hour before bedtime and away we go. Hopefully that makes sense there. Okay, let's move on to the second case. I hope that's all making some sense, and I know time is flying by. We just got one question that said, can you please repeat the role of taurine in case one? Taurine is calming in nature. It's both an amino acid and a neurotransmitter. And I always think of it as an amino acid and a neurotransmitter that loosely binds and turns on GABA receptors. That's how I tend to think of taurine. But think of it as a calming neurotransmitter that's well tolerated, and it has a little bit of a GABAergic perspective that way. So that would work pretty well. Okay. Case one, if you want PEA to be higher during the day for concentration and focus, but slow at night, is it possible to add supplements in a way to accomplish this so that PEA is, if PEA is not high at night, I'm assuming that you're doing the urine sample prior to sleep, do you want to lower the PEA and not affect concentration in the day? PEA levels, we may want to talk about this more a little bit later when we talk about excitatory on another case, but PEA levels for focus and concentration, when you use phenylethylamine and phenylalanine, PEA is the neurotransmitter, phenylalanine is the amino acid. Phenylalanine will quickly convert into PEA and almost act like a non-caffeine mental stimulant. So it's a very quick, nice little cognitive booster if you respond well to it, and then it'll also trickle down a little bit more into some of the excitatory dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine scenarios. So that works really well. And if it's high at night, you're still going to be working on serotonin and GABA to keep it hopefully kind of calmed down indirectly. It is okay to still use phenylalanine during the day for a little cognitive support, especially if you're tired and you're an insomniac. And then one last question here. Do you reserve phosphatidylserine for elevated cortisol only? No, there's two different theories of how to do this. And phosphatidylserine resensitizes cortisol receptors. One theory is if you're under stress, use it multiple times throughout the day to keep your cortisol receptors happy, and hopefully you won't feel as stressed. The other option would be when cortisol is high, whether it's during the daytime or in the evening, maybe that's a nice time to use phosphatidylserine to try to mellow out some of that cortisol rhythm and get better cortisol binding. So that can be a nice way to use that. I tend to use it just when cortisol levels are elevated. That's historically when I've used phosphatidylserine. So in this case, it would be before bedtime. Okay. I'm going to move on to the next case, guys, and we'll take some of these other questions at the end if we have time. Just want to make sure we get through this slide deck so you can hear real life stories. I think that always helps. 23-year-old complaining of inability to fall asleep and wake up at reasonable times. This was diagnosed as delayed sleep phase disorder per his psychologist. He had difficulty falling asleep before 4 a.m. So again, this is where it gets more important. Do you have difficulty sleeping? Yes. Okay, well now let's ask some more questions. What time do you fall asleep? I fall asleep at 4 in the morning. Okay, that is trouble. 10 out of 10 severity on that one is what he rated that as. I'm tired during the day. I bet you are. 6 out of 10 severity on that. And that doesn't feel good at all, right? Mild to moderate anxiety and depression that is more chronic. All of this started when I was 14 years old and hormones started kicking in. So again, for those of you that love doing bioidentical hormones, I enjoy testing and optimizing those as well. A whole lot of problems and challenges with mood and sleep and energy start when we are young, right? During we start to hit that puberty and continue when we're older, beyond 40, and those hormones start to wind down. I'm not saying they're not important to test. I'm just saying with someone who's primarily presenting for insomnia and energy, and they're 23, yeah, you may catch a low testosterone on them, right? Or a high estrogen or something of that sort, but I don't think that's the best place to start for the insomniac. I think we can start with neurotransmitters and adrenal, cortisol and melatonin, get them sleeping better. And then if we're still having other complaints, maybe we look at sex hormones down the line. So sleep a total of typically 6 hours per night. When I'm not working, I can go 10 to 12 pretty easily. No regular exercise. Love my caffeine. You can imagine what havoc that's playing if we're sipping caffeine all day long. Work as an EMT. Hey, how much adrenaline do you get in terms of adrenaline rushes from your emergency medical technician? Not too much anymore. I've been doing it for enough years. I just do my job and let it be what it is. Occasional Claritin seasonally. Previously, both on Zoloft and Wellbutrin. So serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine reuptake inhibitors were in his history. Hadn't been on them for quite some time, many months. Why? Why'd you stop? I just felt like they weren't doing anything anymore. So I worked my way off of them with a prescribing practitioner, and I don't feel like I'm any worse. It hasn't really changed my sleep pattern or my mood at all. All right, interesting. Supplements, 10,000 IU's vitamin D3, probably a little higher than he needs, unless his genetics are really stacked against him with vitamin D. That's a topic for a different day. And multivitamin and some melatonin use. Has tried lifestyle sleep hygiene changes for years without any consistent benefit. Now, he would fall into the category of one of those people who was highly, highly frustrated with his sleep at this point because he had tried all the typical recommendations that he was given, right? Journal and warm baths and do deep breathing and meditation and stuff. And he's like, Scott, none of it works. So what do you got? I'm like, let's look at chemistry and see what we can do. Sounds good. We'll start with hormones. Cortisol first, 1.7, optimal range 1 to 4. This is looking nice. It's this little dot down here in the right you want to look at. Where it's in that green range, that's your optimal range. Yellow is this reference interval. We like this. This is cool stuff. Melatonin, 29, optimal 8 to 24, reference even up to 25. His occasional melatonin use is keeping his melatonin nice and high. Melatonin is not an option for him. If he wants to keep using anywhere between 1 and 5 milligrams for bedtime, that's fine, but I don't know that you're going to get a whole lot more benefit from taking a whole lot more at this time, right? His melatonin output is looking pretty good for a nighttime collection. Now, what else are we going to do? We had a quick question. In this case, what were the work hours for the 23-year-old? The work hours varied. So a lot of times he would do, 4 days on and 3 days off, and they were typically 12-hour shifts, and they would usually start at 6 to 8 in the morning. So you can imagine if you go to bed at 4 and you're getting up at 6 to get rocking, he's not feeling real well. So it was a big, big problem when it came to, I've got to figure out a way to get to sleep earlier so that I can wake up in the morning and go to bed. He largely worked daytime shifts. Very few nighttime shifts. He didn't like to pick up nighttime shifts because it threw his sleep off even more. Let's take a look. Bedtime collection again, because he has difficulty falling asleep, right? Low serotonin, 66 again. Let's get this up towards 100. I think it'll feel better. Dopamine on the high side of normal, but that's not going to affect sleep too much. Norepi and epi being high are going to be the bigger problems. Norepi is nice and low down at 10. I'm going to say that's a yay for me clinically. I don't mind it being low at night at bedtime, and epinephrine at 5. I think that's way too high. I want to get this guy again down towards 2 or so. If we can be down towards 3, 2, even 1, that's probably going to be a little bit easier to fall asleep. Glycine, you can see here, is cranking high. Glycine's inhibitory. Sometimes it does respond to things that are neuroimmune modulating. So sometimes you'll see a really high glycine if histamine or glutamate are really high. It just seems to reflexively shoot itself up there. We don't want to necessarily use more glycine as an inhibitory neurotransmitter support for him for his sleep, but we do want to then look at glutamate levels. 16, we like these guys down on that kind of bottom third. That's great. Histamine, 39, top range is 30. That's not great. We want to make sure we do something to help him with that. He does have seasonal allergies, right? But we can come up with some natural antihistamine support to support that histamine level being lower as time goes on. And I think whether he uses it seasonally or whether he uses a little low dose every night, that may help his sleep patterns a bunch. So where did I start here? I started with some 5-HTP, 50 to 200 milligrams at bedtime. Again, you can start slow with this. Sometimes people that have really low levels of serotonin, I would put this kind of in the moderate low range, right? He's not crazy low. He's not in his 20s or 30s. He's at 66. But if you support their serotonin too fast, sometimes they start to have really wonky dreams and even nightmares and night terrors sometimes. So starting at 50 to 100 milligrams the first week might be a great safe way for you to start supplementing. And then if he feels better up towards 150 or 200 milligrams at bedtime, great. Now he's exhausted during the day. So we've got to get into this excitatory concept during the day. Otherwise, he's going to lose his noodle because he's just running on fumes. And it's okay to support the adrenal excitatory system and the sympathetic system during the day, these catecholamines. Let's give him some tyrosine, 750 milligrams morning and then again before lunch. Let's give him some rhodiola, 250 milligrams morning and then again before lunch. Let's give him some L-dopa for dopamine. Low dose, right? Because it's super pure, 99%. 25 milligrams twice a day. And let's support those catecholamines. Let's get his dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine up where they should be so that he has a little more energy, right? That's going to boost mood, that's going to boost attention, that's really going to support his autonomic sympathetic system, both brain and body. And then if we want to, we can even use some phenylalanine too to help him cognitively during his workday, right? He was also hoping to go back and get back into being a student. So I said, we can use all of these excitatories as long as your sleep is getting better. And on the back end of this, I wanted that natural antihistamine as a good next step. So he said, it can't be this simple. I said, let's go ahead and give it a try. And what I did was I followed up with him once a month. I said, you're going to be in here once a month for the next 3 months, and we're going to hear an update from you and talk through if we want to change anything. And after a month, and I said, keep a journal. This is a great trick. I said, keep a journal because you're not going to remember at the end of 30 days how many nights were actually trending better. So you got to at least tell me, is it getting easier to fall asleep at a bare minimum? He comes in after a month and says, hey, this is starting to get easier, but I'm having a hard time believing that it's going to stick because I just don't think it's going to stick. It can't be this simple. And I'm like, well, it's not simple. We tested all these biomarkers. We understand some of the chemistry behind what they do for sleep-wake cycles. It's taken me years to figure this out. It's not simple, but it's profound in its approach, right? And he's like, yeah, but it's simple in terms of what I'm taking. A couple excitatories in the morning, one inhibitory at night, and eventually some natural antihistamines down the road. This is pretty simple. Month 2, it gets even easier. Month 3, it gets even easier. And then he's just kind of cruising that way. So did he still have tendencies to want to stay up late because that's what he had done since he was 14? Yeah. But if he did a good job saying, I'm going to go to bed, I'm going to go to bed, I'll shoot for 10, hopefully make it around 10 or 11 on these days where I got to wake up at 5 in the morning to start at 6. And a lot of the times it was working brilliantly. He did indeed get back to school and everything just got a lot easier for him. So pretty cool that way. And here's a couple other questions here. If cortisol is low but can't sleep, that's the phosphatidylserine. In general, what time of day do you use it? We did that already. When do you choose 5-HTP versus tryptophan? Tryptophan is a 2-stage conversion process to serotonin, so it's a little slower, maybe a little gentler is the way to think about that. 5-HTP is a 1-step. You don't need nearly as much 5-HTP compared to tryptophan. So if you wanted to do 100 milligrams of 5-HTP, you would do 1,000 milligrams of tryptophan to get the same effect that way. It's kind of a 10-to-1 ratio in most people. So I tend to just use 5-HTP first. If people feel like even 50 milligrams just doesn't feel good for some reason, it irritates their GI tract, even if they eat it with carbs or something of that sort, I might move them towards a tryptophan versus a 5-HTP. But it's not much of a thing for me. There's one other question here about vitamin C, reducing cortisol and optimized dose and timing. Vitamin C is a cofactor for so many neurotransmitter and adrenal health and kind of tonifying. I tend to think of it that way. I tend to use vitamin C more during the day versus at night to reduce cortisol. You could certainly try that. There is benefit sometimes to taking antioxidants at night because the oxidative stress of the body goes up throughout the day. And if we release things like melatonin at night, which has antioxidant scenarios, and maybe take some vitamin C at night, it might benefit the sleep cycle starting to kick in if oxidative stress is high enough. So interesting to see how that would all go. Okay, cool case, right? It was just fun to watch him because even on month 3, he's like, it just can't be this simple. And it's not always that simple. Sometimes you're still scratching your head, but for how chronic his was, right? I mean, he'd been experiencing this for 10 years. He was frustrated. Now he finally had power over his sleep. Like he could finally use his lifestyle and that big brain of his to say, I'm going to go to bed at this time and it's actually going to work because I've got the chemistry balanced out so that my epinephrine's down, my serotonin's up. I've got a histamine product that's able to be done in terms of some natural antihistamine support seasonally when I need it, and it's helping. 36-year-old, insomnia, high stress, fatigue, pre-diabetic. What's going on with insomnia? Right here, sleep, 5 to 6 hours a night total. That's not nearly enough. Wakes up in the middle of the night with a busy brain. How hard is falling asleep? Falling asleep is hard, but it's mostly because I just want to stay up at night and relax because it's kind of my quiet time. I'm chronically worried about a kiddo who's been diagnosed on the autistic spectrum, and those are just my quiet hours. So there's a lifestyle thing going on in terms of, actually falling asleep at a decent time. All right, well, that's on you. And let's make sure your chemistry is optimized so that once you are asleep, you actually want to sleep because you're not waking up in the middle of the night with a busy brain. Vegetarian, both parents are diabetic. Dad is hypothyroid. She is worried about diabetes, so she works out and maintains her weight well. Treadmill twice a week, resistance 4 times a week with a trainer. What do you know about insomnia and diabetic risk? It is hugely connected. If you don't sleep well, your ability to moderate blood sugar becomes much more difficult. So we want to make sure that we get her sleeping well, especially with both parents being diabetic already. We're on a little bit of thyroid medication, levothyroxine, 75 micrograms. We're feeling good on that. We looked at the blood work. Things were looking pretty good. She didn't want to touch that at all. Only take a multivitamin. I need to sleep 8 hours a night, Scott, or I am going to lose my noodle. You got it. Let's see what we can do. We did a 4-point cortisol rhythm on her because she did have some fatigue in the morning and she was curious what her cortisol was. And you can see this is just not great 30 minutes after waking up. And it certainly isn't great at noon. And then she really kicks in and just pushes hard in the afternoon and the evening to rally and get going for the family and the kids. And of course, that doesn't help her sleep. When you have a nighttime cortisol rhythm, that 4th collection down here, right? 7.0, we want it to be under 4 in an ideal world. That is not great. So that is certainly an option for us. What about melatonin? Melatonin of 14, reference range or optimal range 8 to 24. It's kind of smacked in the middle. That's not too bad. Could we use some extra melatonin at night? We could. And then again, with melatonin, you can use instant release if it's hard to fall asleep. You can use controlled release or sustained release if it's hard to stay asleep. So different ways to use the different supplements in terms of how fast they're absorbed, and that can be beneficial for your insomnia patients too. All right, so we've got a cortisol option. We potentially have a melatonin option, though that probably isn't where I'm going to start, right? We did this sample in the middle of the night when she couldn't get back to sleep. She's like, I'm in control of when I really fall asleep. It'll be okay. I need help in the middle of the night so that I don't just get that busy brain wind up that's going on. Sounds good. Let's do the sample collection in the middle of the night. It'll be done after a couple hours of sleep. It's going to give us a snapshot of the urine that's been in your bladder for a couple hours while you were sleeping and what's happening before you wake up and you can't go back to sleep again. And to me, that just makes sense. I know that not everybody does it that way. That's how I like to do it. So that's what we did. And we have a serotonin number that's way down at 46. That's not great. Now, these reference ranges for adult females, you can go a little bit higher than us guys. So now you're, instead of a 98, you're up to 125. She's kicking down at 46. We got to get some serotonin support in there. Dopamine on the nice low side, I'm okay with that, right? Norepinephrine, 18. We definitely want that one to be on the lowish side, that lower 30th percentile. She's doing great there. Reference range 22 to 50. So it's certainly not high. That would be my biggest concern with insomnia. Epinephrine 1.2. That's actually technically low on the reference range, right? But at night, you don't need much epinephrine. So I'm okay with that being on the low side, 1.6 to 8.3. We don't have an overexcited system from norepinephrine and epinephrine. Cross those off the list. What do we have? Glutamate high? Nope, that's looking nice at 16 with a reference range of 12 to 45. What about histamine high? Nope, looking nice, 13, reference range of 14 to 44. Lower 30th percentile? We're good there. What are we gonna do? We need to make sure her serotonin goes up, and we need to get that cortisol reset a little bit. We can also potentially look at some GABA, 2.4, reference range is 2 to 5.6. That is an opportunity. Start with 5-HTP. Give it at bedtime. Start with 50 to 100 milligrams. Jump it up towards 200 milligrams as time goes on. Let's get some licorice root going in the morning, in the daytime, so that she can boost her cortisol rhythm in the morning. Let's add some tyrosine in there for dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine support in the morning, and potentially some rhodiola for the same thing, those catecholamine supports. Always nice to have some essential fatty acids, right? Consider other things such as some of the cinnamon extracts for glucose support and helping some of the blood sugar dysregulation. We were following that as well. And that can play into sleep-wake cycles a little bit, especially with the cortisol being what it is. So we might have better blood sugar regulation through better cortisol rhythms, but we also might have better sleep through better blood sugar regulation, through better cortisol mechanisms as well. So that can be nice. And down the road, if we're getting frustrated with this, say it's been 3 months and she goes, we're not hardly moving the needle on this at all. We've got taurine in our back pocket. We've got theanine in our back pocket. We've got phosphatidylserine for high cortisol at night. I think that's a good idea for sure with that cortisol being elevated. You may not need it for long. You may use it for 1, 2, 3 months and then take it away and see how you do. And if that whole autonomic fight or flight nervous system has calmed down, now they don't need as many supplements to stay there as long as they're sleeping better, feeling more relaxed, generally more healthy, and the system is working like it should, right? Rest and digest at night, nice, and maybe a little more excitation during the day, but we don't want to be in constant automatic sympathetic drive. That just doesn't feel good for anybody. And down the road, if we do want to do a little extra daytime dopamine, norepi, and epi support, we could always add a little extra tyrosine or L-DOPA. But right now, if you get her sleeping better, chances are she's going to have a lot more energy during the day and not feel as high stressed or fatigued. So she did great. Really fun to watch. You know, she said before, I always felt like I was in charge of when I would go to sleep, but having this extra serotonin support makes me just fall asleep so much easier. So thank you. And easily sleeps anywhere between 6 to 8 hours a night, depending upon how many different things she needs to get done, and just feels rested and looks so much healthier and just feels better. Blood sugar levels are doing great. It's cool. Okay, I know I'm rushing just a little bit because I know you guys have some questions. I want to leave at least 5 minutes for that. Insomnia can be initiated from many different factors: physical, cognitive, and emotional, right? Neurotransmitters and adrenal hormones, cortisol especially, transmit impulses that can contribute to a variety of different psychological and physiologic stress areas, including screwing up and having challenges with proper and optimal sleep-wake cycles. If you skew that sleep-wake response, it can be very hard just to moderate your lifestyle and get back on board. It's nice to have the chemistry in your back pocket to understand how it works. A variety of insomnia secondary symptoms, from mood to cognitive issues, addictions, craving, pain, fatigue, GI upset, can all be attributed to neurotransmitter and hormone imbalances, which is nice. You often get, as that autonomic system comes back into balance, you get a lot of secondary positive benefits symptomatically. And testing neurotransmitter and hormone levels enables you, the practitioner, to better utilize targeted therapies to monitor patient responses, both symptomatically, and then you can retest them and do an objective test as well. So it's not just subjective, and that turns out to be pretty cool. So holy cow, that's a lot of information. All right, you guys, thank you so much.